In today's video, we're going to explore the history of the post office. Once upon a time, in order to send a letter, you had to be really quite wealthy, such as a king or something. The reason being you would have to employ someone to go and deliver your letter by hand, and this meant paying for all their expenses. This could be fairly cheap if you wanted a message sent to the neighbouring town, or really expensive if you sent a letter to somewhere like Mordor. Naturally, either way, it was very slow, but this system continued until one day England tried to invade Scotland. You see, at the time, Edward IV was in charge of England, and rather than going up there to Scotland himself, he decided it would be better if he stayed at home and sent battle instructions from hundreds of miles away. To allow this, they had to come up with a quicker system of letter delivery, and so the idea was that horses should be placed every 20 miles or so along the route, and the delivery rider would take a new horse as they came to it. This system allowed the messenger to travel up to 100 miles per day, which was most excellent. Once the war was over and people got on with their lives, Queen Elizabeth was on the throne. Buildings called post houses had been dotted about to help allow the passage of letters around the country, and the Queen made some requirements of the then postal system. Every post house was to have 2 horses, and every rider should carry a horn and blow on it when passing another person, or 4 times per mile. The speed the delivery folk had to travel was 7 miles per hour in summer and 5 miles per hour in winter. This meant that in summer they would toot their horn every 2 minutes, which must have been rather irritating. However, this system was really only for affairs of state or the Queen's private affairs. You could send a letter if you were a pleb, but these were only delivered when someone could be bothered, which is a practice that still goes on today. Eventually, these routes became not only useful for letter delivery, but also became established as travel routes for people looking to explore or get away from their troubles. Whenever there was no post house en route to deliver letters, the nearest local town were compelled to provide a horse to keep this basic postal system alive. This created the opportunity for some devious people to claim they were on Queen's business and get the free use of a horse. You could think of these as rental horses, and in a similar way to how people treat rental cars today, people back then would treat the horses just as badly and use them for things they really weren't meant to do. This wore the horses out, so when time moved on and King James came on the scene, he introduced the idea that people had to prove they were on sovereign business. Furthermore, to ensure good treatment of horses, there was a maximum speed, a maximum load weight, and you could not ride the free rental horse beyond a certain point from where it was hired. Even though the postal system was improving, when foreign merchants came to Britain, they laughed at how inferior it was to their own. So instead of using the postal system in place, they decided to use their own system of delivering mail. This upset the government, and so they took over everything and combined it into one system, and the state monopoly on post was formed. Realizing that monopolies are good at exploiting money, they also had the idea to make private citizens pay for postage if they were to send a letter. The government would then take the funds and use it to pay for things like unnecessary wars. A bloke called Thomas Witherings was put in charge of this new postal system, and he positioned post offices on key routes, and new roads were built to help facilitate the transportation of mail. Not all routes were as well used as others, and some quickly came into disrepair, and in many cases horses were no longer used, instead being replaced with people travelling on foot. This had the effect that to get a reply to a letter sent from London to Scotland, it took 2 months. Eventually this became too ridiculous, and with a bit of effort and reorganisation, they got this down to 6 days. They did this by creating major hubs, and then smaller distributors would branch out from there. Before the reorganisation, people would write haste post haste on the letter to make them go faster, just like go faster stripes on a car. But with the new system, people realised it was no longer needed. This is not to say that the system was efficient, because even if you wanted to post something to a nearby place, it had to go through an established postal route. This could see the letter travel much further than needed, and as people were paying by distance travelled, they had to pay more because of it. It wasn't too much of an issue though, as many people didn't know the system existed, and things like newspapers weren't really a thing yet, so it wasn't like they could advertise this letter delivery system. Eventually, a list of post towns did appear in Richard Blom's Britannia, which helped to create awareness of where people could send letters. However, the problem was that even if you could send a letter, most houses did not have numbers and was difficult to find the intended recipient anyway. London then decided they would like their own postal system to deliver letters within the capital, and so their own private postal system was set up with 400 to 500 local offices sprouting up almost overnight. Best of all, it only cost a penny to send a letter from one part of London to another. Deliveries were up to 4 times per day for residential and 8 for industrial premises, and the mail was insured up to £10. People posted letters at places like cafes, and they would have a notice in the window saying, "Penny post letters and parcels are taken in here." After an initial few years of losses, it was just about to turn a profit when the Duke of York, not to be confused with the grand old Duke of York from the nursery rhyme, he decided that the penny post was an infringement on the national monopoly, and then just like before, the courts incorporated this new postal system into the pre-existing one. The guy who had set up the penny post suffered not only the losses of establishing the penny post to begin with, but now had to pay damages too. Later it was realised that this was a bit mean, and he was given some pension money and given a job, but after a few years this abruptly stopped. Much messing around with the price of sending letters happened over many years, but eventually they fixed the price into law. Unfortunately, members of Parliament were given the right to use the postal system for free, which they abused greatly, and they sent letters on behalf of acquaintances, friends and family, much like people lending you their Netflix account today, and this ultimately cost the post service money. Around 1735, members of Parliament found that many of the letters they received had been opened already on arrival. After a good bit of persuasion, they held an inquiry and found that there had been a department specifically set up to read some of the letters passing through the system. However, at this time, it wasn't a general populace concern, considering half the population at least were illiterate. Anyway, the unusual pricing at the time was such that small letters could be charged as a double letter if it had been written by more than one person, and so obviously to find this out, letters were opened to check. Furthermore, at the time it wasn't a big crime to tamper with the mail. To put this in context, small acts of thefts were punishable by death, but mail tampering carried a small fine. Eventually it was taken a bit more seriously, but this took a while to really sink in. Even when they first installed post boxes, it still took them a while to figure out that they should be covered, in a fixed position, and locked. When the post office decided to make things actually secure, they used an armed guard on the road to stop thieving. Moreover, the punishment for stealing mail was given an upgrade, and it too was now punishable by death. They also decided to become more efficient and have post office staff actively be ready for mail arriving at certain times when the mail coach was expected. If there was a delay in it arriving, they were to send a rider to search for the coach. With the introduction of coaches, they could also carry people, and these people would pay per mile, and so this became a kind of early bus service. Lateness was no longer tolerated, and fines were introduced on workers to encourage reliability as much as possible. They also introduced robbery-proof coaches. This had the effect of going from being robbed once a week to nothing in 8 years. Eventually, newspapers started to become more popular around 1800, and literacy was on the up. Toll roads also appeared, and it was declared that the post office had to pay to use them. This had the result that they tried to reduce the number of coaches, and this annoyed the people who had used them for travel, but the post office didn't care, as it cared about the letters, not the travellers. Eventually, trains came into being, which was to significantly alter the transportation of mail, although it did take many years for this to become established. It was also around then that they came up with the idea of charging a flat rate for letters posted anywhere in the country, only altering the charge for weight. This was going to make the post a service for all, as it would attract those who thought it previously too expensive. Originally, the price of sending a letter had been seen as a tax on communication and proved unfavourable, so people sought means to avoid paying both legally and illegally. The introduction of cheap postage came through the realisation that higher volumes would make them more money, and with the capitalist mindset, reliable cheap postage was established and so continues today. This is also when the penny black stamp came into being, as well as the iconic pillar post boxes. After a while, the post office began to diversify the services it offered, and with the rise of money orders, it also became a savings bank, plus a place to buy insurance and annuities. Around 1900, motor vehicles began appearing, but initially there was doubt if they would really be up to the job of transporting mail. Of course, they ended up being reliable, and soon horses were replaced with trains, planes, and automobiles, although without the hijinks of a comedy film. As new communication developed like the telegram, telephone, and radio, the post office, which was still determined to claim a monopoly on communication, sought to own all of these, which they did. Eventually, they were handed over to different departments and then bits sold off to private companies. It took until 1974 for everywhere in the UK to have a postcode, and that helped greatly with efficiency. They even collected TV license fees up to 1991, and in my attempt to be a real YouTuber, I have a video loosely related to that subject which you can see here. The post office ended up becoming a state-owned limited company and separated from the Royal Mail Group. Royal Mail went on to become privatised whilst the post office remained state-owned. And that is the story of the post office. If you have any suggestions of videos you would like to see in the future, please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.